How Vlad the Impaler destroyed 40,000 Ottomans in a night attack. The Battle of Târgoviște. Imagine waking up in the middle of the night to absolute chaos. You're a soldier in the most powerful army on earth. You've conquered kingdoms. You've marched across continents. And your sultan has never lost a major campaign. And then, out of total darkness, death comes screaming at you from every direction. Men are dying around you. Your horses are panicking. Fire is lighting up the sky. And your commanding officers can't even figure out where the attack is coming from, because it's coming from everywhere at once. By the time the sun rises, 20,000, maybe more of your brothers in arms are dead. And the man responsible, he's already vanished back into the forests, like a ghost. That actually happened in June of 1462. A man who would eventually become the inspiration for one of the most famous monsters in literary history, led one of the most audacious, terrifying, and tactically brilliant night raids in the history of medieval warfare. His name was Vlad III, Prince of Wallachia, and the world would come to know him as Vlad the Impaler. Now, if you've been following this channel for a while, you know that we don't just tell you the scary version of history. We go deep. We look at the context. We look at the strategy. We look at the politics, the geography, the personalities, and all the messy, complicated human decisions that led to moments like this. 1. Because the story of Vlad the Impaler and his night attack on the Ottoman camp at Târgoviște is not just a horror story. It is a masterclass in asymmetric warfare. It is the story of a small, outgunned, outnumbered leader refusing to lie down and die. And it is the story of how one man's sheer ferocity forced one of the greatest military powers in human history to turn around and go home. So let's go all the way back and understand exactly how we got here. To understand Vlad, you have to understand Wallachia. Today, Wallachia is part of Romania, but in the 15th century, it was a small principality sandwiched between some very dangerous neighbors. To the south and east, you had the expanding Ottoman Empire under Sultan Mehmed II, the same man who had conquered Constantinople in 1453 and ended the Byzantine Empire. To the north and west, you had the Kingdom of Hungary, which had its own imperial ambitions and was constantly interfering in Wallachian politics. And to the east, you had Moldavia. Wallachia was, in short, a small piece of meat sitting between several very hungry wolves. The rulers of Wallachia had to be incredibly careful. You had to play these great powers against each other. You had to know when to submit, when to resist, when to make alliances, and when to break them. It was a game of survival, and it required a certain kind of person, someone cold, someone calculating, someone who understood that in that part of the world, at that point in history, mercy was a luxury that could get you killed. Vlad was born somewhere around 1428 or 1431. His father was Vlad II, also known as Vlad Dracula, meaning Vlad the Dragon, because he was a member of the Order of the Dragon, a chivalric order created by the Holy Roman Emperor to defend Christian Europe against the Ottoman Turks. So right from the beginning, Vlad grew up in a world where the conflict between Christian Europe and the Ottoman Empire was personal. It was family business. But here's the thing that really shaped Vlad, the thing that explains almost everything about the man he became. When he was around 11 or 12 years old, his father made a deal with the Ottomans. To secure peace and maintain his rule, Vlad Dracula handed over 2 of his sons as hostages to Sultan Mehmed II. One of those sons was Vlad, the other was his younger brother Radu. Think about what that means. You are a child. Your father sends you to live in the court of a foreign power, a power that your culture, your religion, and your family are supposed to be fighting against. You are kept as a guarantee that your father will behave. And if your father steps out of line, you are the one who suffers the consequences. Vlad spent years in Ottoman captivity. Historians debate exactly how he was treated. Some say the Ottomans actually educated him well, that he learned about Ottoman politics and military tactics, and even spoke Turkish fluently. Others suggest the treatment was harsher, that there was a cruelty to his captivity that left permanent psychological scars. We honestly don't know the full truth. What we do know is that this experience did something profound to Vlad. It made him deeply suspicious of everyone. It made him brutal in a way that went beyond even the brutal standards of his era, and it gave him a very personal hatred of the Ottomans that would define his entire career as a ruler. While Vlad was sitting in Ottoman custody, things back home were falling apart. His father, Vlad Dracula, was murdered in 1447. His older brother Mircea was blinded with hot irons and buried alive by political rivals. Wallachia was consumed by a bloody succession crisis. Vlad would eventually make his first grab for power in 1448, but he only held the throne for a couple of months before being driven out again. He had to spend years in exile, in Moldavia, in Hungary, building alliances, waiting for his moment. That moment finally came in 1456. Vlad seized the throne of Wallachia for the second time, and this time he was determined to hold it. And the way he held it tells you everything you need to know about the kind of ruler he had become. One of the first things Vlad did was deal with the boyars, the Wallachian nobility. These were the powerful noble families who had spent decades playing all sides, installing and removing princes as it suited them, and generally making Wallachia impossible to govern. They were part of the reason his father had been killed. They were part of the reason the country was weak and chaotic. Vlad decided to solve this problem in the most direct and final way imaginable. He invited hundreds of boyars and their families to a feast, and then he had them arrested, the older ones, the ones he considered too old to be useful. He had impaled on the spot the younger ones and their families. He marched off on a forced labor project to build his castle at Poenari. Many of them died from the brutal conditions. Vlad simply did not care. This is what gave him his famous name, Vlad Tepes, or Vlad the Impaler. Impalement was not invented by Vlad. Impalement was not invented by Vlad. It had been used as a method of execution for centuries across different cultures. But Vlad used it on a scale and with a specificity that shocked even hardened contemporaries. He reportedly impaled thousands of people during his reign, criminals, prisoners of war, political enemies, foreign merchants who he believed were cheating his country. He had different heights of stakes for different ranks of victims, so that a nobleman would die slightly higher off the ground than a commoner. There are accounts, some possibly exaggerated by German propaganda pamphlets of the time, of him dining among forests of impaled bodies. Now here's where context matters. Was Vlad uniquely sadistic? Probably, yes, to some degree, but he also existed in a context where extreme violence was a recognized tool of rule. The Ottoman Turks used impalement. European rulers tortured and executed people in horrific ways. What made Vlad unusual was the scale, the consistency, and the seeming enjoyment of it. He was trying to send a message to his own nobles, to foreign powers, to anyone who thought Wallachia was weak and easy to manipulate. The message was simple: cross me, and this is what happens to you. And for a while it worked. Wallachia, under Vlad, became surprisingly stable. Merchants could travel freely because crime was terrifyingly low. Nobody wanted to steal anything in a country where the punishment was a stake through the body. The nobles were cowed, the country was unified, and Vlad turned his attention to his real enemy, the Ottomans. The relationship between Vlad and the Ottomans during his second reign was complicated. Technically, Wallachia was a vassal state of the Ottoman Empire. This meant Vlad was supposed to pay tribute and provide troops when the Sultan demanded it. For a while, Vlad played this game, at least superficially, but he was also simultaneously building alliances with Hungary, specifically with the Hungarian ruler Matthias Corvinus, working towards some kind of organized Christian resistance against Ottoman expansion. The tension fina broke in 1461 and 1462. Sultan Mehmed II, fresh off his conquest of Constantinople, and still in the middle of a massive expansion campaign, decided he'd had enough of Vlad's defiance. Vlad had stopped paying tribute. He had refused to send troops. He had allied with Hungary, and on top of all that, he had conducted his own raids into Ottoman territory in Bulgaria, killing tens of thousands of Ottoman subjects and officials. He sent Mehmed a famously gloating letter describing the carnage in graphic detail, reportedly saying something along the lines of, "I have killed 23,884 Turks and Bulgarians, without counting those who were burned in their homes or whose heads were not cut off by our soldiers." This was not a diplomatic communication. This was a declaration of war. Mehmed's response was to assemble one of the largest armies the Ottomans had put together in years. Estimates vary, but most historians put the Ottoman force at somewhere between 60,000 and 90,000 soldiers, including elite Janissary infantry, cavalry, siege artillery, and a massive logistical support operation. This was the army that had taken Constantinople. This was the most formidable military force in the known world, and it was coming for Wallachia. Vlad's forces, by contrast, numbered somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 men, mostly light cavalry and infantry. He had no hope of meeting the Ottomans in a traditional open field battle. He was massively outnumbered and outgunned. He didn't have the fortifications, the artillery, or the manpower to simply stand and fight. So he made a decision that showed his true genius as a military commander. He would not fight the Ottomans the way they expected to be fought. He would fight them in a completely different way. What Vlad did was deploy something that military historians now recognize as a textbook example of scorched earth tactics combined with guerrilla warfare. As the Ottoman army crossed the Danube and moved north into Wallachia, they found almost nothing. Vlad had ordered his own people to abandon their villages and take everything with them. Crops were burned, wells were poisoned or filled in, livestock was driven away. The Ottomans were advancing through an empty, devastated landscape with no food, no water, and no way to resupply off the land. The supply lines stretching back across the Danube were long and vulnerable, and then Vlad's forces started hitting those supply lines. Small, fast-moving raiding parties would strike at supply convoys, kill soldiers, then disappear back into the forests before the Ottomans could mount a proper response. The Ottomans couldn't find a target to fight. There was no Wallachian army sitting somewhere waiting to be destroyed. There were just shadows in the trees and dead soldiers in the morning, and the psychological pressure on the Ottoman army was enormous. They were marching through a dead country, losing men to unseen enemies, running low on supplies, and advancing on a capital city that seemed to get further away the more they marched. And then, somewhere around June 17, 1462, Vlad decided to go from psychological warfare to something far more dramatic. He decided to kill the Sultan, not metaphorically, not symbolically. He literally planned a raid designed to penetrate the Ottoman camp, find Mehmed II in his tent, and kill him personally. If he could decapitate the Ottoman command, the entire campaign might collapse. The army would lose its leadership, its coherence, its political legitimacy. It was insane. It was almost certainly suicidal, and it was exactly the kind of move that Vlad was willing to make. The preparations for the night attack were meticulous. Vlad reportedly had his own men dress in Ottoman clothing so they could move through the dark camp without immediately being recognized. He gathered intelligence on the layout of the Ottoman encampment, where the Sultan's tent was located, where the Janissaries were positioned, where the horses were kept. He planned the timing for the deepest part of the night, when guards would be at their least alert and soldiers would be in the heaviest sleep. And then, sometime in the night, probably between midnight and the early hours of the morning, Vlad led somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 men, depending on which source you believe, in a raid directly into the heart of the Ottoman camp. What followed was absolute carnage. Vlad's forces hit multiple points of the camp simultaneously. They killed soldiers in their sleep. They set fire to tents. They stampeded horses through sleeping formations. The noise, the chaos, the fire, and the complete disorientation of being attacked from multiple directions in total darkness caused a massive breakdown in Ottoman cohesion. Units couldn't form up. Commanders couldn't communicate with each other. The darkness meant that nobody could tell friend from enemy. Ottoman soldiers were reportedly killing each other in the confusion. According to various chronicles of the time, the Ottoman casualties from this single night raid were enormous. Numbers range from 15,000 to 40,000 dead, though most modern historians are cautious about the higher figures. Even the most conservative estimates suggest it was one of the deadliest single-night engagements in medieval military history. The chaos lasted through the night and into the early hours, and when dawn came, Vlad and his forces were gone. They had melted back into the forests of Wallachia like they had never been there. There was one crucial failure though. The Sultan survived. Vlad's forces got very close to the command tent, close enough that in some accounts they actually attacked what they thought was the Sultan's quarters, only to find they had killed two of Mehmed's grand viziers instead. Mehmed himself had been moved, or had reacted quickly enough that Vlad's assassination squad found the wrong target. It was agonizingly close. If Vlad had actually managed to kill Mehmed that night, the history of southeastern Europe might have looked very different. But even without killing the Sultan, the raid had achieved something remarkable. The Ottoman advance toward Târgoviște, which was Wallachia's capital at the time, continued, but it continued with an army that was badly shaken, sleep-deprived, hungry, and psychologically rattled. When they finally reached Târgoviște, they found the city abandoned. Vlad had ordered its evacuation. There was nothing there for the Ottomans to conquer. No treasure, no defenders, no population to subjugate. And then they found something that broke them completely. Outside the city, Vlad had constructed what historical sources describe as a forest of impaled bodies. We're talking about somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 dead, mostly Ottoman prisoners of war and Bulgarian traitors impaled on stakes of varying heights and arranged across a field several kilometers wide. The stakes were positioned so that as the Ottoman army approached, they would walk through this field, surrounded on both sides by rotting corpses. The smell alone would have been overwhelming. Some sources say the stakes stretched for miles. Some say the Ottomans could smell it before they could see it. What was this? On one level, it was absolutely calculated psychological terror. Vlad was sending a message to Mehmed. This is what I do to your soldiers. This is what I will keep doing. This is the kind of war, you are fighting. But it was also, in a horrible way, it was a masterstroke of psychological warfare, because it worked. Contemporary Ottoman sources, including the memoirs of a Greek-born Ottoman chronicler named Critoboulos, describe Mehmed as being visibly shaken by the sight. Mehmed II, the man who had conquered Constantinople, who had fought dozens of campaigns across 3 continents, was described as being astonished and turning away. The Ottoman army reportedly recoiled from the sight. There were soldiers who refused to advance further. Some historians point to this moment, this field of impaled corpses outside Târgoviște, as the effective end of Mehmed's campaign against Wallachia. The Sultan didn't abandon the campaign immediately. He pressed on for a while longer, fought a few more engagements, and eventually installed Vlad's brother, Radu. Yes, the same younger brother who had been taken as an Ottoman hostage alongside Vlad and had actually assimilated into Ottoman culture and became a loyal servant of the Sultan as the new ruler of Wallachia. And eventually, Vlad was forced to flee. His political situation unraveled. His hoped-for Hungarian ally Matthias Corvinus, who was supposed to be leading a crusade to support Wallachia, had done almost nothing concrete to help. Without external military support, Vlad couldn't sustain a guerrilla campaign indefinitely. He retreated into Transylvania, and in one of the stranger twists of this whole story, he ended up being arrested and imprisoned by the very man he thought was his ally, Matthias Corvinus. The Hungarians put out propaganda claiming Vlad had been secretly in contact with the Ottomans. Whether that was true or just a convenient excuse, Vlad spent roughly the next 12 years in Hungarian captivity. He would eventually rule Wallachia for a brief third time in 1476, but he died in battle that same year, likely in December 1476, possibly killed by an Ottoman assassin, or possibly in a confused skirmish, where his own men mistook him for an Ottoman rider and cut him down. His head was reportedly sent to Constantinople, where Mehmed had it displayed publicly to prove that the man who had tormented his armies was finally dead. How do we evaluate Vlad the Impaler? The easy answer is to focus on the horror, the impaling, the brutal executions, the calculated cruelty. And look, that's all real. Nobody is going to sit here and tell you that Vlad was a nice person or that his methods were justifiable by any modern ethical standard. He absolutely was responsible for mass atrocities. The numbers of people he killed, even the lowest credible estimates, represent genuine, enormous human suffering. But if you only focus on the horror, you miss the military and political genius that operated underneath it, because what Vlad achieved in 1462 against the Ottoman army was genuinely extraordinary. Think about the strategic situation. His country was tiny. His army was a fraction of the Ottoman force. He had no major fortifications capable of withstanding a sustained Ottoman siege. He had no reliable external military support. By every conventional military calculation, Wallachia should have been conquered in weeks. Instead, Vlad tied down one of the greatest armies in the world for an entire campaigning season, inflicted devastating casualties through guerrilla tactics and the night attack, psychologically broke the morale of an otherwise invincible force, and ultimately forced the Ottomans to settle for a diplomatic solution rather than a military conquest. That is not the record of a simple sadist. That is the record of an extraordinarily capable military and political operator who understood that in his specific situation, conventional tactics were suicide, and that the only way to survive was to make the cost of fighting him so high that even the most powerful enemy would decide it wasn't worth it. The scorched earth tactics, denying the Ottoman army the ability to live off the land, that was sophisticated strategic thinking. The use of night attacks to compensate for numerical inferiority, that is classic asymmetric warfare doctrine, the psychological warfare, the impalement fields. The calculated terror was brutal, but it was also part of a coherent strategy to undermine Ottoman morale and will to fight. And it worked. There is a concept in military theory called cost imposition. The idea that when you can't win a direct confrontation, you make the confrontation so costly, so painful, so exhausting for the stronger party that they choose to disengage. Vlad was practicing cost imposition 600 years before the term was invented, and he was doing it against arguably the most formidable military power of the 15th century. Modern military historians have compared his 1462 campaign to various famous examples of small powers resisting overwhelming force through guerrilla tactics. The comparisons are not exact, and every historical situation is unique, but the underlying logic, deny your enemy the easy victory, hit them where they're vulnerable, make them pay a price they didn't expect, was exactly what Vlad was doing. There's also something worth thinking about in terms of how Vlad was remembered and why his legacy became so distorted. A lot of what we know about Vlad comes from German pamphlets that were printed in the years after his death. These pamphlets were sensationalist, almost certainly exaggerated, and served clear political purposes. The German-speaking world had complicated relationships with Transylvania and Wallachia, and portraying Vlad as a monster served certain narratives. The Ottomans, for obvious reasons, also had an interest in portraying the man who had humiliated their greatest sultan as a savage barbarian rather than a brilliant military opponent. The Romanian tradition actually remembers Vlad quite differently. In Romanian folk memory and in the national historical consciousness that developed particularly in the 19th and 20th centuries, Vlad Tepes is remembered primarily as a defender of his country, as a strong ruler who refused to bow to foreign domination, as someone who may have been ruthless, but who used that ruthlessness in service of Wallachian independence. Several polls in Romania have placed Vlad among the greatest figures in Romanian history. There is even a widely circulated story, probably apocryphal but beloved, of a foreign ambassador who arrived at Vlad's court wearing a hat and refused to remove it. Vlad reportedly had the hat nailed to the ambassador's head, saying he was simply helping the man keep it on. It's the kind of dark joke that tells you something about how Romanians chose to frame Vlad's legendary intransigence. And then, of course, there is Bram Stoker's Dracula, published in 1897, which drew on the figure of Vlad, among other sources, to create the Count Dracula character. Stoker apparently did some research into Wallachian and Transylvanian history, and the name Dracula itself comes from Vlad's family name, Dracul, the dragon, or as it could also be translated, the devil. The vampire legend obviously has nothing directly to do with the historical Vlad, but the connection shows how deeply the image of this particular man, this dark, cold, frighteningly powerful figure from the Carpathian borderlands, had lodged itself in the European imagination. What is remarkable, sitting here and looking at the full sweep of Vlad's story, is how much suffering shaped a single human being and how that suffering was then radiated outward onto everyone around him. A child taken hostage, a father murdered, a brother buried alive, years of exile, the constant, grinding knowledge that your country was a pawn in other people's games. That experience does something to a person. It doesn't excuse what Vlad became, but it does explain it in a way that simple monsterizing never can. The night attack of 1462 is the peak of his story. It is the moment when everything that Vlad was, the intelligence, the ruthlessness, the total refusal to accept that he was beaten, the willingness to do whatever it took, no matter how insane or how brutal, it all came together in a single night of fire and chaos in the middle of an Ottoman camp. He didn't win the war, he didn't save his throne, he didn't even kill the Sultan, but he showed in the most dramatic way possible that a small country with a determined enough leader could make even the greatest empire in the world bleed. Mehmed II went home. Think about what that means. The man who ended the Roman Empire, the man who conquered more territory in a single reign than almost any other ruler of his age, went home from Wallachia without a clean victory. He settled for Radu as a compromise ruler. He didn't level Târgoviște. He didn't exterminate the Wallachian population. He accepted a settlement that left Wallachia as a nominally autonomous vassal rather than a directly administered Ottoman province, which was the fate of much of the Balkans. And a big part of the reason for that was because Vlad the Impaler had made the alternative simply too costly to contemplate. If that doesn't make you stop and think about what one person in the right place, with the right combination of skill and madness and desperate determination, can accomplish against impossible odds, then I don't know what will. That is the true story of the Battle of Târgoviște. Not a fairy tale about a vampire, not a simple horror story about a sadistic tyrant, but the deeply human, deeply complicated, and genuinely extraordinary story of a man who took everything the world threw at him, turned it into a weapon, and aimed it at the most powerful army on earth. And if you found this story as fascinating as I did, researching and putting it together, then hit that like button. It genuinely helps us keep making these deep dives into the corners of history that don't always get the attention they deserve. Subscribe to From Start to Now if you haven't already, because we do this every single week. We've got videos on everything from ancient empires to early modern warfare to the strange personal lives of people who changed the world. Every story we tell, we try to tell properly, with context, with honesty, with real respect for how complicated and strange and fascinating human history actually is. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think about Vlad. Do you think history has judged him too harshly? Not harshly enough? Or is he just too complicated for simple judgments? I read every comment. I genuinely do. And some of the best conversations on this channel happen down there. There's also a video right here that I think you are going to love. It connects directly to some of what we talked about today, and it goes even deeper into the Ottoman Empire at the height of its power. Click it. You won't regret it. I'll see you in the next one.